I think we can all agree that the worst thing a character can be is boring. If there is no entertainment value in their appearance in the narrative and they are supposed to be contributing to said narrative, then your game is in serious trouble. That's hard to come back from. With that said, the second worst thing that a character can be is annoying. An annoying character doesn't just not contribute to the narrative, but can actively detract from it. If you annoy the player enough, you're just as likely to lose them as you are if you bore them. Why then is it the second worst thing and not the worst thing? Well, I would argue because a boring character, once that opinion has seeped in, has lost the way. An annoying character with smart writing and development, though, can rise far beyond the initial feelings. Of course, I am introducing this video with this line of thinking because Luc fon Fabre from Tales of the Abyss is a supremely annoying character when he starts out. One that I've actively seen players turned off by or even drop the game entirely because of, unwilling to stick it out to see him get better. And he does get better. A lot better. It is a bold choice on the writer's part, but committing to making a character that starts out unlikable also gives the story a lot of chances to allow him to not just grow out of it, but to learn from the realization of how miserable he had been and how he treated the people around him. Not a lot of writers in any form of media are willing to make such an alienating main character, but Tales of the Abyss would not be the same without Luc fon Fabre's journey from naive spoiled brat to a proper hero. That journey will tackle themes of identity, what makes us who we are, absolution, how does one work to restore the damage they caused, and connecting both of those, our capacity for change. Tales of the Abyss does a fantastic job of showing Luc at his worst and best, and allowing us to reflect on what it takes for someone to change. Our first introduction to Luc is as he stares out his bedroom window at the sky. I don't know if it is purposeful, but it evokes the same longing for freedom that we see from characters like Rapunzel. He doesn't even talk in this scene as he gazes out and then looks down. As we learn early on in the game, Luc fon Fabre is pretty much as stuck in his home as Rapunzel is in her tower. 7 years ago, Luc was kidnapped by a rival empire. Since then, he has lost all of his memory from before the kidnapping, and worry over the Malkuth Empire trying it again plus his memory loss has led to his sequesterment. His only solace in his crushing boredom is hanging out with his friend Guy and his training bouts with Master Van. It doesn't help that he keeps getting these headaches while a strange voice sounds in his head as well, but for once, that isn't the strangest thing that will happen to Luc today. Before we get to that moment, some of the establishing character moments for Luc that I think are critically important are the opening shot I already talked about, the dismissiveness that he talks to pretty much everyone, his ignorance of a lot that would likely be common knowledge in this country, such as who Phone Master Ion is, and his selfishness, as his first thought is about how Ion's disappearance affects him personally. We also see how important Luc's bond with Master Van is. Compared to his parents, Van stands as the voice of reason and understanding for Luc and his circumstances. It makes total sense why he would be so attached to Van, and why he is the only person Luc treats with respect. Then the inciting incident happens during training with Master Van as a girl named Tyr appears who can charm people to sleep with him and attempts to assassinate Van. When Luc intervenes, he and Tyr get teleported away. After waking up with Tyr checking on him, odd behavior for an assassin you'd think, Luc quickly pushes away and demands answers. Perhaps surprisingly, he gets the answers, but given his sheltered life, he needs to be coached through what she even means when she says hyperresonance and seventh phonist. It will not be the last time Luc needs basic world information explained to him. Annoying for him, helpful for us players. This strongly reinforces just how ignorant Luc is, not by choice, but by circumstance. We also get a nugget of information from Tyr asserting that the royal family has been protecting Luc because he is the seventh phonist. Luc's reaction to his ignorance being exposed? I think you know everything, don't you? It's a topic he is very sensitive to, which tracks with how anyone would react. No one likes to admit they don't know something, and Luc has a lot of things he doesn't know. The ignorance also spreads to how one goes about paying for things, seen with the interaction with the coachman, and then in a more charming way to Luc's reaction to the dreadnought chasing the Darkwings. Of course, that pales in comparison to the revelation that instead of being in Luc's home kingdom of Kimlaska, they were teleported into the enemy Malkuth Empire. Due to that, Luke and Tyr have a long journey ahead of them, and they stop in a town called Engave on the way, where Luke is promptly arrested for stealing, which he was innocent of, but his entitled attitude and lack of knowledge on how to pay for things or how valuable food is doomed him. This accusation is how he and Tyr run into Jade Curtis and the supposedly missing Phone Master Ion. Side note, it is adorable how flustered Luke gets when Ion is complimenting him. I think it's part of the sheltered life he's led that getting unexpected compliments is both incredibly pleasing and also highly embarrassing for Luke. Ion, in fact, has a lot of similarities in circumstances as Luke, both coming from sheltered upbringings into positions of relative power, but that history shows in their personalities in different ways. Ion has a wide-eyed innocence and caring personality, while Luke has a more standoffish and selfish manner. Their difference in reaction to the danger to the Cheagles in Engave illustrates that distinction clearly, as well as their treatment of Mew. We also see during the Engave episode Tyr's opinion of Luke turning more and more negative. She definitely wants to see him taken down a peg, something I'm sure plenty of players are thinking at this point as well. But Tyr's journey with her relationship with Luke will also be a helpful proxy for the audience's relationship with him, at least that's the hope. Luke is still capable of being a caring and sensitive human being, though. He protects Mew, and then tries to claim he's just protecting Ion because he can't show care and sensitivity, and he worries about breaking the Liger eggs. Luke has stronger sensitive feelings, but clearly doesn't feel like he can share them or develop strong empathy. Perhaps because people react like Tyr did when she says, "You're quite kind," or perhaps just soft. Sure, that's been the attitude around Luke for a while, and may have also contributed to his emotional immaturity, as he, like a lot of young men, has been conditioned to not show any softer emotion. Despite his attitude, Luke does still have a sense of right and wrong, like when he calls out Jade for lecturing Ion while the latter was trying to apologize. This selfless moment is only somewhat ruined by him abusing Mew immediately afterwards, but that's unfortunately just a byproduct of the humor of the game. After being brought aboard Jade's ship, the Tartarus, Luke is presented with an offer and a lot more background information. The conflict between Malkuth and Kimlaska is starting to bubble up again. At the same time, the supposedly neutral Order of Lorelei is divided between those who want a war and those who want to work for peace. Jade and Ion are working on the Malkuth and Lorelei side of things to bring a peace treaty forward, and they need Luke, or rather his social status in Kimlaska, to help the process along. Luke's response to this request is sarcasm and entitlement. And didn't anyone ever teach you to bow your head in respect when asking someone for a favor? To the surprise of everyone in the room, including Luke, Jade acquiesces. When Luke asks if Jade has any pride, Jade responds, "None so cheap as to be shaken by something as petty as this, sir." While Luke mainly brushes by this point in agreeing to the proposal, I think it is telling that Luke's attitude, especially towards Jade, shifts after this conversation. I don't think Luke has encountered many, if any, people who are willing to swallow their pride for the betterment of others, so seeing Jade do so is unnerving, but also would provoke further thought and consideration. Sure, Jade's sincerity is not high, when is it ever, but it is clear Luke doesn't know what to do when confronted with exactly what he asked for, but not in the manner he wanted it in. When the Tartarus is later attacked and Luke is asked to stay back to keep out of the way, a downed soldier suddenly attacks him. Luke, in clear desperation and self-defense, kills the soldier. This is the first time Luke has seemed actually shaken and scared, and it is followed immediately by an important encounter. Luke's first meeting with Ash, who starts things off on a great tone by insulting Luke and calling him a worthless reject. We'll come back to Ash and all the meaning behind that phrase, but Luke's focus then and moving forward is understandably focused on the fact that he took another person's life. As Jade and Tyr plan their escape, Luke is wallowing in guilt about the person he just killed. He is averse to fighting so soon after such a traumatic experience. Unlike Tyr and Jade, Luke is not a soldier. He is experiencing all this for the first time, and he is scared and guilt-stricken. It doesn't help that Tyr and Jade are not particularly sympathetic to Luke's situation. Jade even wonders what kind of environment he grew up in to be this ignorant of the situation, to which Tyr explains exactly how Luke grew up. That sort of experience would shake anyone, let alone someone as naive and sheltered as Luke. While Jade and Tyr are right that they are defending against those trying to kill them and that war will bring far more death, Luke can't think big picture like that at this moment. In part, that's because of his morals being tested with the death, and part because he is still thinking selfishly. As he says, "That's got nothing to do with me." It's understandable, though, that he is thinking selfishly because Luke's also right that he didn't choose for any of this to happen, so it's a situation where no one is really right or wrong. There's just a difference in perspective. The way they get over this gap is from Tyr taking responsibility for Luke being in the situation in the first place and explaining their point of view, to which Luke explains his. Tyr doesn't want to kill either, but she is pragmatic and experienced enough to understand what Luke does not. Sometimes they simply don't have a choice. After Guy helps them rescue Ion and escape, they rest for a moment, but then another group of soldiers attacks. Luke has one at his mercy and declines to strike the killing blow, to which he is in turn disarmed and Tyr takes the blow meant for him. By the campfire afterwards, Ion cuts to the heart of Luke's struggles relative to his companions. For Jade and Tyr, fighting is their job, so the things they say can sound a bit extreme. You're a civilian, so I think your hesitation and concern are to be expected. When he talks to Jade, Jade mentions how the world probably would be better without as many soldiers. And then Tyr comments on how she hadn't fully considered Luke's background and then apologizes again. While all of them do show a level of care for what Luke is going through, it is unsurprisingly Guy, who knows Luke best, who talks about what Luke has been going through specifically. Luke has been having a tough time. Thrown out into the world, and specifically a world of violence and politics that he is woefully unprepared for. They try to take Luke away from fighting, but that is not actually what Luke wants. In this moment, Luke wants to feel useful, wants to feel like he's not a burden. And yes, that means that he will try to overcome his feelings when it comes to fighting. However, Luke still has his red lines, such as when he steps in a little later to stop Jade from killing an unconscious Arietta. The next test of Luke comes while they are infiltrating St. Bina, and some of the other members of the party imply that Van is trying to start a war. Luke reacts very defensively about the accusation towards Van, which is unsurprising given his personal relationship and hero worship of Van. In general, Luke reverts back to his entitled and generally irascible nature after this, which Jade describes as whining. It seems, though, that they're in the clear, but once they arrive at the border Kaitsur, the party is ambushed by Ash the Bloody, and Luke may have been killed if Van hadn't intervened. While Van does admonish Luke for his parry attempt, he also compliments Luke, saying he did an admirable job in getting through this ordeal. After some interference from the God Generals, Luke and crew are heading back to the capital. During this time, Tyr and Luke have a conversation regarding Seventh Fonus and what they are. Before getting into the weeds of that, though, there is an exchange I think helps Tyr understand more about the challenges Luke has faced since losing his memory. After Tyr asks if he studied knowledge like the phonons after losing his memory, Luke replies, "I had a lot of other things I had to learn. My parents' faces." I believe that comment, more than anything else, drove home to Tyr how Luke feels. It's unimaginable in some cases to wake up with no memories of the past and no recognition of those around you. Of course you'd have to pick and choose what knowledge you try to regain, otherwise you'd never do anything and would feel intimidated by the sheer amount of knowledge lost. It's after this exchange that Tyr decides to take on that tutor role for Luke in learning how the world works, at least with regards to this matter. She even apologizes for not taking Luke's memory loss seriously and being unkind to him. It's been up and down, but Luke and Tyr's bond appears to be growing, and again, at the same time, I think players are feeling a little more sympathetic towards Luke. As if Luke needs more things to worry about, a hyper-resonance begins to occur between Luke and a voice in his head. Only Van's timely arrival and instructions helps bring it to an end, but Luke is understandably worried about what is going on with him. The sum of it is pretty much that Luke is an incredibly powerful potential weapon, able to create and destroy in a way no other person is capable of. That's why he was kept captive, to which Luke obviously responds negatively. Not only doesn't want to be trapped, but he also doesn't want to be a weapon. He struggled enough killing a single person in self-defense, let alone being solely responsible for destruction untold in a war. Van then gives another way out. Preventing the war can gain Luke the privilege and power to escape the life he has been forced into to this point. Van also gets Luke to calm down by catering to his ego with all the hero talk. It's that bolstering of his confidence that allows Luke to barge straight in to talk to the king and admonish Grand Maestro Mose for delivering incorrect information to the king. Sometimes Luke's bluntness and entitlement can be used to the team's advantage. Returning home, Luke starts being told hints towards something happening to Van. When he learns that Van may be arrested and executed, Luke turns to Natalia, the princess and his betrothed, to Luke's chagrin, to help him. It mostly has been seen with Van, but when Luke respects and likes someone, he becomes a lot more considerate and selfless. This is why I see Luke reassuring Tyr that Luke's mother's illness is not Tyr's fault, as a sign of his growing appreciation for her. If he didn't care, he wouldn't have said anything. At this point, Luke has 4 people I'd say he will go out of his way for. His mother, Van, Guy, and Tyr. Once again, it's the Van connection, though, that drives Luke forward to accepting his role as goodwill ambassador to Akzeriuth. As Jade points out, he will become a lot more cooperative when Van is involved. Beyond that, though, this is where we first hear of what Yulia foretold in the score. Now, the score is going to be incredibly important to this story, but to suffice, Yulia foretold about one who would be known as the light of the sacred flame, with a description that describes Luke perfectly. On top of Van's hero talk earlier, now Luke knows he is the chosen one, destined to go to Akzeriuth and lead Kimlaska Landvidir to new prosperity. While all that sounds good, Van tells Luke that there is something that the king and others are hiding. Another part of the prophecy. The youth will turn power to calamity and be as a weapon of Kimlaska. This is the last thing that Luke wants, to be both trapped and a weapon. Van positions himself as the only one Luke can trust, the only one who has been working for what is best for Luke from the beginning. I've been coy about it so far, but Van is using the tactics of a serial manipulator, isolating Luke and training him to disbelieve what others say and what his own eyes may see. Just Van and only Van. And it's working because Van has offered Luke purpose and validation at every turn. He has nurtured this relationship for years. The question is, what he's been nurturing it for. The role of ambassador also brings forward a new behavior in Luke. Now he feels he has power, which he does to an extent. He quells criticism of his deal with Natalia to bring her along with a because I said so attitude. While that may occasionally get people to follow what you have to say, it is limited to just respect for position or wanting to avoid annoyance, not any real leadership. You can see that as soon as Luke is presented with a difficult choice under the burden of leadership, and then complains about being asked to decide. It is somewhat understandable given sheltered upbringing, isn't ready for this position, and he did just have his first proper look at Ash and how similar he looks to Luke, so it's understandable he was distracted. But Luke is showing that he's just not a leader at this point. That distraction gets even more literal when Luke has another headache with a voice in his head that he now recognizes as Ash. These headaches become more and more frequent, and in one of them, Ash remarks, "You are connected to me. You are me!" Side note, this game was not as subtle about some of these things as I remembered it being. Ash then uses the connection to control Luke's actions, in this instance pulling a sword on Tyr and then collapsing. He seems to be alright after that, except his personality, which continues to grow more and more arrogant. It's seen a couple times in the main story, such as his words at the start of the Dio Pass and his reaction to Natalia trying to check on a man from the mines. You can also see it in the skits when the reality of the situation does not measure up to the idealized form Luke likely had in his head of how he would ride in as a savior without having to do anything actually difficult. As the party heads down into the mines, the members start dwindling, distracted by various other important matters until it's just Luke and Ion who meet up with Van. Despite Ash's warnings and interference, Luke presses on because he is single-mindedly focused on his mission. As he tells Ion, "Everything will be okay if you do what Master Van says." Except, it won't. Van's plan is revealed when he uses the command, "Foolish replica Luke," to unleash Luke's power and cause a hyper-resonance, destroying Akzeriuth, killing all those they came to save, and bringing about war between Malkuth and Kimlaska. Van was manipulating everything from the start, and his final contemptuous comment to Luke reveals his real feelings. Hardy and Luke only managed to survive because of Tyr's phonic hymn, and they are unable to save anyone else. They plunge down into the cliff-off, an underground world that Tyr and Van originally came from. Once they are out of immediate danger, the party turns to trying to figure out what went so wrong. Luke insists he and Van were just trying to neutralize the miasma, but the reality is Van used Luke's power to disintegrate the supports holding up Akzeriuth and the land around it. When Luke then asks, "Are you saying it's my fault?" the result is silence. When it comes to blame, Van obviously takes the brunt of it. And I hope I've made it clear up to this point why Van's strategy was so effective. Luke was a classic victim of abuse and gaslighting. He was isolated from others and manipulated into thinking that Van was the only one he could trust, the only one who really cared and wanted him to succeed and live a true life. He is a victim, but he is the victim who had the most choice in the matter. Despite having others he could have trusted, could have told, despite Ash's repeated warnings, Luke latches on to the idea of it not being his fault, which again is partly true and partly not. In response, Jade leaves, followed by Natalia, Annis, and Ion. Just Guy, Tyr, and Mew, the three people in the party that probably had the most respect for Luke before now. When Luke appeals to Guy to back him that it is Van's fault and not his, Guy's response, "Luke, don't make me think even less of you," followed up with Tyr's, "I was stupid for starting to think you had some good in you." Mew's attempt to relate Luke's situation to his own with burning down the Cheagle forest, it's too much. Luke breaks down. The next stage for Luke is self-pity. He doesn't want to talk to anyone else. He doesn't want to go to the mayor's office because he thinks everyone will just spend the time blaming him. Then we get what is effectively Luke's manifestation of self-hatred in Ash, which makes sense as Ash reveals that Luke is a replica of him, a copy made when Van kidnapped Ash from Batical. Luke never lost his memories. He didn't have them to begin with. Luke, of course, does not believe this information when presented to him and tries to attack Ash. After Ash defeats him, Luke is unconscious in bed but sees events through Ash's eyes and head. This allows Luke a unique perspective into Ash's mind, what the others are saying about him when Luke's not around, and the efforts to stop Van. This is an invaluable part to Luke's development as a literal example of seeing from another perspective. It probably would have helped if it wasn't a perspective that actively hated Luke, but it's a unique scenario to begin with, not a lot of space to be picky. Through Ash's eyes, he sees the extent of Van's plans and the hurtful and helpful things his friends say about him. He sees Annis's disdain, Guy's continued faith in him, Ion's guilt, Jade's past, Natalia's insecurity. All of this is an important part of Luke's development of empathy. Luke is starting to understand the impact of his actions, which leads into the scene when Luke finally wakes up and talks with the one party member who stayed behind, Tyr. Luke wants to head to St. Bina because Ash said it was in trouble. When Tyr tells him just following what someone else says is exactly what he did before with Van, Luke does something unexpected. He agrees and says Tyr is right. As he says, "Up till now, all I ever paid attention to was myself, and I'm not even sure I saw myself clearly." Because of his actions, because of the insight that he has gained, Luke sees the need for change and has the desire to change. Tyr acknowledges that this is how Luke can change, but it won't change what happened in Akzeriuth. So she asks Luke how he plans to change, to which Luke replies, "I don't know." He doesn't know the next step. He just knows that he needs to take a step, take an action, do something to start the process of changing for the better, to start the process of making up for what he has done. As they say, doing something is always better than doing nothing. In this case, it is a tiny step, a symbolic one. But Luke using Tyr's knife to cut off his hair is a change, a rejection of who he has been, a symbol of a new start. Yes, it is a commonly used trope, but it's common for a reason, and Tales of the Abyss uses it in the perfect spot. This is the start of Luke's redemption and what really makes him a great character. Tales of the Abyss allowed Luke to fall to his lowest moment. Now it is time for him to start the journey back, but he won't be alone on that journey. Tyr will be watching him the entire time. One of the themes of the second half of Tales of the Abyss is brought about with the score, a telling of the history unfolding that some think of as inevitable and others as a warning to help avoid. Some then, Akzeriuth, while tragic, was inevitable. The score has a promised, prosperous, destined future which allows them to ignore all the destruction and death that come on that required path. Who deserves to know the future? How will that impact actions, and what happens if they don't follow the score? We see quickly that while actions speak louder than words, Luke is more careful and considerate with his words. Speaks out about the disaster of Akzeriuth when Tyr's grandfather calls Van's actions admirable, and he thanks Tyr for trusting him with personal information about herself. Tyr remarks, "That's the first time you've ever thanked me for anything." This remark is echoed by Guy not long after to really emphasize the difference in attitude, just in case we missed it. Throughout his time traveling to Doth, Luke continues to wonder about how to make up for Akzeriuth. There's a lot of talk, including archetypes we've seen before, like the always unhappy atoner. Ultimately, where Guy ends up, and I think it's a smart one, is to try and help as many people as possible. If Luke puts in the effort to do that, that's all anyone can ask. The first step in that is regaining trust. Guy and Tyr are nice and willing to give Luke a chance, but he soon faces much greater disdain from Jade and Annis upon their reunions. His first real chance to show the changes is with Saint Bina, as he declares to the Emperor that he is going to save everyone. He also extends his trust to Guy, even after learning about his enmity towards the Fabre family, and starts learning more about phonology from Tyr. Luke is beginning to show the actions to back up his words. Thanks to Luke and the party's efforts, they successfully evacuate every person from Saint Bina. Despite this, Luke is still looking for how to save Saint Bina the location as well. When his planned idea is shot down, he explains that he has to do something now. While Luke is changing, his impatience from earlier is rearing its head in a different way. He wants to help as much as he can, even if it's risky or unlikely. As Jade remarks though, you won't get anything done like that. Putting yourself out, risking everything and never accepting when the odds are steep in certain circumstances can seem heroic, but it is rarely effective, and in the long term, it is impossible to maintain. Luke again shows his maturity by accepting that he is wrong in this situation and accepting an alternative course of action. It's not all bad news though, as Elder McGovern shares with Luke that Jade's act of scolding him was, in a sense, a sign of liking Luke. He didn't bother if he didn't care. Luke is starting to win back the trust of the party. With the more prudent plan, the party is able to revive the Sephiroth holding up Saint Bina, with Luke using his training from Tyr to accomplish this monumental task. His reaction after succeeding at doing so, "We did it!" and hugging and thanking Tyr for help. His approach has really turned from a me to an us approach, and that is why they are starting to succeed in their mission. Back on the surface though, things are not going as smoothly as the war begins between Kimlaska and Malkuth, right over the area previously covered by a Sephiroth tree and at risk of collapse at any point. This is a split path point, as Luke can choose either to go to Kaitsur with Natalia to negotiate a ceasefire, or go with Jade to help evacuate Engave. Unfortunately, the people in power, either through unwavering belief in the score or desire for personal gain, are unwilling to pull back on the war. So while Engave's people are saved, the war rages on. The land is still about to fall, and to make matters worse, Cassidonia, where the people fled to, is next on Van's list to bring down. This time, Luke and the party get to the Sephiroth tree in time not to stop the descent to the cliff off, but to make it of steady decline to protect the people without risk of it slipping under the mantle of miasma. Doing the difficult procedure twice, it would be easy for the success to go to Luke's head, like the titles and praise did before Akzeriuth. But again, Luke shows his change by acknowledging that he is actively trying to avoid that happening. He recognizes that his arrogance is one of the reasons that he was so susceptible to Van's manipulation. There's also still plenty of work to do, as Jade discovers that the whole Sephiroth tree system is on the verge of collapsing, meaning all of the Outer Lands could be on its way to follow Akzeriuth, Saint Bina, and Cassidonia. After discovering that the score has indeed been taken off track and being captured by Mose and Dis to escort to Baticul, the group has a discussion. In it, Luke starts out thinking that his death may get the score back on track, back to the promised prosperity. But Tyr tells him the opposite. Luke isn't bound by the score. As a replica, he was never accounted for in the score, and therefore he can break it and build an even better future. That's what Van used for his plan, but now it is Luke's turn to do so in a more world-friendly manner. While I'm sure it was not Luke's intention, his words also made it look like he was looking for absolution for his sins and death, a fact that Tyr picks up on and is furious about. Redemption through death is a common trope, but Luke is not going to go down that path if Tyr has anything to say about it. After the events in Baticul, which are far more important for Natalia than Luke, the party escapes and sets off to a new town. Upon arriving, Luke is mistaken for Ash and brought to Van. Perhaps in another story, this would be where Luke could confront Van about the events of Akzeriuth, but Van hardly acknowledges Luke. The only reason he does is to talk about how inferior Luke is to Ash. Worthless replica. An inferior copy. The bigger point is Van's hatred of the score. It's not unwarranted, but it has led him to extreme action to break its power over humanity. The party, to counter Van's plan, decides to lower all the Outer Lands in a controlled manner before Van can do it out of control, and establish actual peace between Kimlaska and Malkuth. Luke's resolve is also tested by the loss of the older engineers helping them. This is a common reaction for Luke when things go wrong in the second half, blaming himself for not being strong enough. As usual, it's Tyr who has to say the hard-to-swallow truth. They have to go on, they have to act, or the sacrifice will be a waste. The connection between Luke and Tyr continues to grow because, in a lot of ways, Tyr is what Luke originally said Van was, the one who scolds, praises, and holds Luke accountable. That doesn't mean that Luke just goes along with what Tyr says, though, because their relationship is one of equals, not master-apprentice. When the party finds out the damage that Tyr's body has been through due to her role in lowering the Outer Lands, Luke really wants to be selfish and tell Tyr to stop. He respects her choice in the matter and understands the gravity of the decision. Luke prior to Akzeriuth never could have made that same decision, nor explained to Tyr why the decision was so hard in the first place. He can't admit his feelings for her, but hey, he's made a lot of progress and it's not like she's great at sharing her feelings either. The main plot has been taking up much of the focus. Circumstances in Ketterberg force the party to slow down, allowing for Luke to get some one-on-one time with each of the cast members. I'll highlight the most revealing ones here. Jade talks about thinking that he would never be able to like Luke and acknowledges, in typical Jade fashion, that he is not so bad. More importantly though, Jade has noticed Luke's continued grief and guilt from not only Akzeriuth, but taking the lives of bandits or Oracle Knights fighting against them. Luke in turn shows his respect for Jade in terms that Jade can work with given his dislike of being looked up to. With Tyr, Luke plays the role of the comforter and the one who backs up Tyr's feelings and plans a course of action to try and convince Van. This is lost in the connection between Luke and Van, but Van and Tyr are siblings. She's been going through a rough time. Luke pretty much plays the role that Tyr has played for him, so it's unsurprising this is when Tyr can fully acknowledge that Luke has changed. For Ion, the interaction focuses on Luke's similarities with Ion, and since Ion has known since the beginning that he was a replica, he has experienced Luke doesn't, while also knowing that his existence is the latest in the long line and his death would just mean they make a new Ion. Can't relate to that part, but he can relate to feeling like an inferior replacement for the real person, either the real Ion in Ion's case, or Ash in Luke's case. As Luke says, they can't make a new Ion, at least not the Ion that Luke knows. Our experiences shape who we are, and those are impossible to replicate. Luke even gets the chance to thank Ash for what he has done for him, even if it's been done in an irascible manner. Luke confirms his suspicions when he confronts Van about why Luke was created, and about disrupting Yulia's score. One thing that Van says that will stick with Luke is, "Can you not live unless you were born for some purpose?" Of course Luke worries about that. He was designed as a replacement, and the original now could come back and take back the name Luke and his position at any point. Luke's original purpose for even existing has already been fulfilled, So what is his purpose now? Be resolved now, but it is a point that Luke and Ash will have to confront one day. With Van's defeat, the way is free to balance everything out, but Luke learns that things are not quite over. Lorelei is still in danger, and thus the world itself is still in danger. More evidence emerges when the planet storm grows and Van's sword, left behind when he fell at the absorption gate, disappears. This leads to Luke traveling around, coincidentally in the footsteps of Ash, as he tries to piece together what is happening. Along this journey, he reunites with the party. It is his conversation with Tyr that reveals the most, as usual. Doesn't believe he has a me. He is still thinking of himself as just Ash's replica, to which Tyr tells him to ask everyone if Luke has a me. Everyone else does indeed think of Luke as separate and a different individual from Ash. There are only two people who don't: Luke himself and Ash. While Luke is dealing with his personal crisis, the party is dealing with the revelation that the God Generals are alive and Van may be as well. The potential resumption of war and Moses' disappearance, none of which are good. The subsequent events include Annis's betrayal under duress, Ion's sacrifice to heal Tyr, and his death leading to Luke comforting Annis. Luke has already used his experience to comfort Tyr in the past. Now he uses it for Annis's benefit. He can relate to Annis's guilt to a degree and displays strong empathy in helping Annis through the results of her actions. Luke's turn to extend the trust and grace that he was given to someone else. Now Luke and the others can focus on the race to the key of Lorelei. With the investigation though, they find the replicas that Van, Mose, and the God Generals created. That sets up an interesting dilemma for Luke. The other replicas do not care about the originals, do not consider themselves inferior or less worthy of life. It is basically the complete opposite of how Luke feels. Luke does think he is inferior and less worthy of life than Ash. I'm not sure I would attribute it to a confidence issue as Tyr and Guy do, but Luke does have a significant deficit of self-worth post-Akzeriuth. He doesn't need the level of confidence and will to live that the replicas do, but he does need to recognize his role and his worth as a human being if he is to proceed forward. That is hard to do though when Luke sees how people treat all the other replicas being created now, with abuse and insults at every turn. He relates to them, and that pain and abuse then gets internalized. It comes to a head when Luke manipulates the situation to get Ash to reunite with his parents. Luke does that as part of a larger plan to sacrifice himself with the Sword of Lorelei to clear the miasma. As he tells Guy, "I have no right to exist, no replica does," to which Guy interrupts and Ash follows up telling Luke to get over that inferiority complex before you go proposing anything stupid. Has pretty much reversed his biggest problem. Formerly, he had an inflated self-worth. Now it is as low as possible, and both can cause serious issues. Luke also seems to accept, like the replicas at the Tower of Rem, that this era does not want or need them. However, Luke does still have at least some desire to live. As Ash confronts him about whether Luke would die in his place, Luke hesitates. It does seem, though, that the decision will lie with Luke. The choice of Ash, himself, or the replicas looms over his head. An unenviable position. The others are wrestling with the same problem. All of them say they don't want Luke to die, but as Guy acknowledges, "I know it's not that simple. The fact that you realize that shows just how much you've grown too." Luke is understandably torn and scared. What Tyr says, though, is truly what is important in this case. That Luke does have a choice and should be allowed to make it, just as she did when she chose to continue opening the passage rings even though she knew it would lead to her death, Ion intervention notwithstanding. She could make her feelings clear on the matter, though. She doesn't want Luke to die. Luke then takes that energy to admonish Ash for his own stubbornness and willingness to sacrifice himself, an unthinkable action until recently. Luke has found a way to be useful, perhaps the only way, as he puts it. The other replicas come to a similar conclusion. Despite Tyr and the party's wishes, the sacrifice is prepared. Luke and Ash's argument as to who must be the one to die goes back and forth. Luke claims he should be the one as the replica, the copy, the one who is unneeded. to which Ash responds that he didn't have his life stolen by someone unneeded. In the struggle, Luke gains the upper hand and takes action. As he prepares for death though, all Luke can think of is that he doesn't want to die. He wants to live, for no one's sake but his own. Ash joins to give the last boost of power, and then the miasma is gone, the replicas are gone, but Luke and Ash are still there. The danger isn't over, both because Van and the God Generals are still out, and because Luke's cells are separating and declining. He doesn't have long before he disintegrates entirely, but since it is incurable, he chooses to continue and fight on. He also decides to keep this a secret from the rest of the party. However, he is unable to deceive Master Liar Jade. Oh, and Mew as well, since he was just lingering there too, easy to overlook, who immediately blabs to Tyr. While the deception is cruel, Luke also explains to Tyr that he couldn't continue if everyone knew. If everyone knew, they would treat him differently, and he would be constantly reminded of his fate, which he was already scared enough about. Deceiving them feels like the only way for Luke to soldier on. Accepting his fate, Luke is able to accept other things, like his own status as a replica, and that what Ash thinks of him doesn't really matter. Luke teaches us that people can change. He teaches us that with his upbringing, as he grows up in the same environment as Ash, but isn't the same person. He teaches us that as he resolves to and does change after the events of Akzeriuth and becomes a better, more in-depth person, a more caring, a more heroic person. Not everyone does change. They need to have a willingness and drive to do so, and it is rare to find someone willing to change to the degree Luke does. It is possible. That's a hopeful thing to think of when it comes to ourselves and the people around us, both people we love and strangers. It can be scary as well, but Luke fon Fabre shows how to take the fears and keep going. From here on out, there are 3 very important moments to talk about, starting with Tyr and Luke's conversation before the final dungeon. He expresses to Tyr how happy he is, in spite of all the circumstances, because he has finally found himself. I have friends, and you. I can finally think of myself as me. Everyone else was able to recognize before, but Luke has found his me. The second that confirms the first is his duel with Ash. Luke and Ash both fall into a trap that only one of them can get out of. So once again, they argue back and forth on who should go and who should stay. Ash then pulls out his sword to challenge Luke. The stronger one must advance, so they shall duel to decide who. And at least according to Ash, it is a fight to settle who they are. Luke already knows who he is though, and if showing that strength is what he has to do to finally convince Ash, he will go all out. Luke wins, and despite his unwillingness, leaves Ash behind to hold off the enemies. Luke does make Ash promise that he will survive. Promise Ash will not get to keep. Just one obstacle remains in their way. First, Van tries to convince Luke to join him, as Luke's power augmented by Ash is now greater than either could use on their own. He understands what he had wanted before. He wanted Van to acknowledge and accept him as a human being, a wish that would never be granted. Isn't capable of that anymore. Luke doesn't need anyone else to acknowledge his worth. No special meaning in living. It's a philosophy similar to that of Friedrich Nietzsche and his nihilistic views that nothing truly matters. And Luke are coming at it from 2 different sides of that same idea. No coincidence that this game is called Tales of the Abyss, when one of Nietzsche's famous quotes was, "And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you." The point though for Luke is a different philosophy, counter to nihilism, summed up by this quote from the TV show Angel.
Nothing we do matters, and all that matters is what we do.
Luke in that to mean what he established with Guy many hours ago in the game. The best path forward is to help everyone as much as possible. Life has no need for inherent purpose because he gives it purpose by living it however he so chooses. All he needed was the desire to live, and Luke chooses to make a better world for all those currently living in it. party use that desire to live to power their attacks and defeat Van. Luke stays behind to release Lorelei, but the rest of the party insists that he has to come back. He promises he will. He frees Lorelei, and then disappears along with Ash's body into the light. 2 years later, Tyr and the others wait at the field where Tyr and Luke teleported to at the beginning of the game. They turn to leave, and then Tyr spots a man with red hair in the field of flowers. When Tyr asks, "Why are you here?" the man replies, "This place has a nice view of Hod, and also I promised someone." Ends Tales of the Abyss. Now, the debate on this ending has most certainly drawn a lot of discussion and debate, but the word for the developers has pretty much given the fans carte blanche to decide if that was Luke, Ash, or some combination of the two. There are solid arguments for any and all interpretations, partly because I think the developers chose it to be that way. Personally, though, I feel that it is only satisfying for me if that person at the end is Luke. Which brings us to the part of the video where I talk about the themes and character foils for Luke. First though, I have to say kudos to Yuri Lowenthal for his vocal performances as both Luke and Ash. Now, Tales of the Abyss has several themes that surround all the characters. It's part of what makes this cast so great and the story richer for it. Luke's biggest struggle throughout the game is linked to identity. In fact, that's a common theme for most of the party, what with Guy hiding/forgetting his past, and Natalia's switched at birth story. Then there's Ash's situation, where he is the original with a replica alternative out there living what was supposed to be his life. Ion is a replica with another replica of him out there in the form of Sync. Luke, though, has the unique struggle as a replica with the original still out there living at the same time. It takes a while for him to realize the value in his life, even as a copy, because while he was initially copied and those who manipulated him view him only as an inferior copy, there are those who respect and like him for who he is. 7 years of memories, of experiences separate him from Ash, and Luke can't and shouldn't undo all that difference. As Tyr remarks to him in Sheridan, "You're here now," a lesson Luke takes to heart to make a difference. He even uses Tyr's same thought process to help convince King Ingobert that Natalia, despite not being his blood, is still his daughter after 17 years of raising her as his own. He does still struggle with who he is, even more so once he witnesses other replicas in the way they are treated, as disposable or monstrous. In the end though, as he explains several times to Ash and also Van at the end, his mere existence is enough. He has found his identity through his bonds, memories, and experiences, and that is enough to argue for his existence. As he says, "Here I am, alive." And that means he gets to choose his destiny. The second theme comes from absolution. How does one make up for their sins? Biggest in-game example with the destruction of Akzeriuth. He changes his attitude, gains empathy, and dedicates his life and energy to stopping anything like Akzeriuth happening again. He therefore follows in the footsteps of a character like Jade, whose mistakes led to Professor Nebulim's death and inadvertently to most of the issues of the game via his discovery of Thaumacrine. Luke also uses his experience to forgive and work with Annis for her betrayal of the party. Plenty of the other characters exhibit similar guilt towards actions they took or didn't take. Ion and Tyr even take on some of the blame for Akzeriuth. Going back to Tyr and Luke's discussion at the middle of the game when Luke is struggling with how to proceed forward post-Akzeriuth, there are many ways people can try. But the path Luke picked is probably the hardest and the best path in my opinion. Sacrificing himself nobly is what some stories would have had happen, but Tales of the Abyss went through the ringer to make Luke better in all ways, and still at the end had Jade tell Luke that no matter how much you change or regret your actions, not what you've done will be forgiven. To come back alive, to continue making up for it. A fact Jade knows all too well. And another reason why I prefer the Luke coming back interpretation of the ending. Absolution is a process, and it is the act itself that is worthy, even if it never achieves completion. To briefly touch on the third theme, since I went into more detail on it throughout the summary, let's touch on people changing. Tyr becomes less of the model soldier and accepts that people can change and gets more in touch with her emotions. We see Jade at the culmination of his change post Professor Nebulim's death. Guy grows and starts recovering from his trauma associated with Hod. Annis finds a worthwhile path post her spy revelation in Ion's death. Natalia's whole world changes, and then she finds what parts of her she likes and continues on as the princess. Everyone is changing in the party. It's just Luke's change that is the most dramatic and important for the overall story. You know who doesn't change over the story? Van and the God Generals. That's part of the message. Now, as for character foils, I really will only talk about two of them. And yes, it's the two obvious ones. Luke and Ash, of course, are the biggest foils I've ever seen in my entire time playing games, to the point that towards the end, Luke has to insist to Ash that he is not Ash. The reason why they are different, why Luke is, at least according to Ash, naive and won't claim himself superior, is because Luke recognizes eventually what Ash takes much longer to realize. Luke is not the same person. From the moment he was born, he diverged from Ash's path. Initially, that came in the form of entitlement, and later on in hope and his ability to work with others. The reason why Luke succeeds where Ash doesn't is because Ash cannot work with other people. Luke's greatest strength post-Akzeriuth is the group of people he forms around himself. Together they accomplish what neither Ash nor Luke can do on their own. They are similarly stubborn and have similar mannerisms. They have the same powers and movesets, and for a while they look exactly the same. That doesn't mean they are the same or can replace one another. Now, the ending does throw a wrench into this, unfortunately, with its ambiguity over who came back. Is this person one of them coming back and the other is gone completely? Are they a combination of the two, in which case they really are actually the same? I expressed my personal belief already in the summary section, so I'll leave it at that. It is a somewhat maddening part of the discussion when it comes to Luke and Ash, but I still enjoy the theme of establishing one's own identity and the very real differences between Luke and Ash that are both blatantly and subtly pointed at in the narrative. Now, the other foil for Luke is Van himself. Both of them are at the center of the destruction of a place and people that they had little control over themselves, that was foretold in the score. There were people they trusted that manipulated them into being the cause of the destruction of either Hod or Akzeriuth. This understandably left both Luke and Van with a deep mistrust of the score and those who insist that the score is the only way to live life. What differs between them, then, are two things. Unlike Ash, Van does know how to work with other people. In fact, he is specifically very good at working with those who feel discarded or left behind in society. He used that with Luke earlier. This applies most strongly to Sync and Arietta of the Six God Generals, but also applies to his work with both Ash and Luke. The key difference is that Luke also gathers a group of people and never treats any of them as disposable. Van sees the people around him as disposable to his true goal, and that makes sense because his entire goal is to dispose of everyone and replace them with replicas. Van's viewpoint is so nihilistic, he believes that the complete destruction of the world is the only way to achieve said aims, which explains his disregard for his allies' safety as well as his own. Luke similarly does not care for the score and understands that the world as it is now is unjust. However, Luke shows great concern and care for those working with him, and not in the manipulative manner Van took with Luke early on. Luke also extends that to all the people in the world, and Luke even shows more care for the replicas that Van creates than Van did. He also takes more of a reformer route than Van's burn-it-all-down approach when it comes to society. He appeals to those in power and galvanizes them to do something about the catastrophes, leading by example on numerous occasions. In the end, it is a similar worldview between Van and Luke about the need to change and break from the score. The greatest difference is how they act and how they try to solve the world's problems. Otherwise, their history and mindset have strong similarities. Van simply gave up on humanity, and Luke didn't. Thank you to those of you who have watched all the way to the end. I knew as soon as the Tales of Remastered project was announced and I saw that 2025 would be the 20-year anniversary of Tales of the Abyss that I wanted to make this video. I will try my best to manifest an HD remaster of Tales of the Abyss soon so that more people will get the chance to play it and discover how great a game it is, and how great Luke is as a character. Feel free to comment below for future Rio if that applies to you. I'd love to hear it. If a remaster still hasn't happened though, please don't tell me that. I want to believe. As always, the character analysis videos take a lot more from me than my standard fare, but I wouldn't keep making them if I didn't have so many of you who vocally appreciate them, and I thank you for it. Therefore, if you enjoyed, please take the time to like, comment, and subscribe. I can't guarantee when the next character analysis will come out, but I do promise to keep making them if you keep watching. Thank you again for watching. I hope you all have a great day, and happy gaming.